In this tutorial, you're going to learn how to create a gradient map shader, one that takes a gradient texture as an input to recolor your image. You can then change the gradient to change the colors of the sprite or of an entire scene. This tutorial, we're going to see how to code the gradient shader. It holds in just a few lines of code, and it's a very good one to know. We'll also see how to create and edit gradients directly in the Godot editor, or also how to do it in Krita or in a similar program, which might be interesting thanks to the color palettes and the better gradient editing tools that you will find there. If you're just getting started with shaders, you should check our intro series with Bastien Elige. You can find the sources in the description. Let's get started. Here's how the shader works. You take a sprite, a character, or you can take a full composition, apply the material to a canvas layer in Godot, for instance. So you take that character and you're going to desaturate the colors. There are a few methods to desaturate colors, a few calculations that give different results. We're going to use one similar to that lightness one, although not exactly the same, one optimized for games. So you take that, and these grayscale tones that you have, the whites to the black, you can visualize them as a scale from black to white, as a linear scale. And we're going to replace these colors, we're going to sample colors from a gradient based on the tone we have on the character. So let's say we have a middle gray like this one, and that it roughly corresponds to the tone that you have here. We look into the gradient, what color this corresponds to, and we replace it. That's what the gradient map shader does. It does that for every pixel on the character. And once we're done with that, we mix the resulting color with the source character, so you can change the opacity of the effect. In order to use the shader and to see what our code is doing, we need a gradient texture. We can create one straight in Godot. Expand the inspector and click the file icon at the top left of it to create a new resource. Look for gradient, and not the gradient resource, but the gradient texture. It's going to create a texture that Godot will regenerate for you based on a gradient resource. For the width, you can go down to 256 pixels. Or the default being a 2480 pixels by 1, it's actually a very small texture as well, so you don't have to bother really. Then in the gradient slot, create a new gradient and click to expand the gradient editor. Having a large inspector makes it easier to edit the gradient stops and to pre-visualize all the range of colors that you will get. So the default black to white gradient represents the grayscale values, the basic scale we are going to operate on. You want to left click somewhere on the gradient to add a stop, right click on a stop to remove it. The interesting thing with this default gradient is that this is the range of colors we are going to remap on our gradient. And if you click somewhere, Godot will interpolate between the two stops that are to its left and to its right. It will give you, if you prefer, the exact tone that you have at this point where you click by default. And so to edit this color, you go to the rightmost of the gradient, click on the color swatch. And that's the interesting part here. We get a line that shows us the luminosity of this value. So you can see that this is a dark gray, and you can change the hue on the right side of the wheel and click somewhere to change just the saturation of that tone. That way you kind of preserve the luminosity of the original colors when you apply your gradient map. You can do, again, click somewhere in the brighter range to add a new color stop and change the tone there. Note that the interpolation between the colors in RGB mode is going to be linear, and it tends to give pretty bad results. So you always want to edit these colors manually, almost always. Here's a nice gradient that you can use to remap the tone of a scene to a sunset-like one. You might want to have some purple in the dark area, some yellow closing in on the white value, and in between the two, if you look at the color gradient, you get a bit of a grayish tone in the middle. There again, that's RGB color interpolation for you. You want to click in the middle, and we're going to remap that one instead of a disgusting brown to something a bit more red or orange. It's up to you. I think a reddish tone that's a bit more vibrant will look a lot better. You can then save your resource by clicking the floppy disk, save as. We are going to save it. I put everything in a gradient folder. You can see I prepared some as sunsets.tres. Let us now create our material and our shader. So select a sprite in the scene, and you want to go down to the material subcategory under canvas item, create a new shader material. Then in the shader slot, you want to create a new shader. We're not going to use the shader graph editor. I'm just going to code this one, as it's just a few lines really. Click on the shader slot to open the shader editor, and we can get started coding. We want to start in this editor with the type of shader we are going to create. It's of type canvas item, the one you use for 2D scenes. Then the render mode is unshaded if you don't want to use the built-in 2D lighting on the node. We need a gradient texture that we're going to export in the inspector. You can see as I add this line here, I'm getting a new shader parameter category in the inspector with a gradient slot. So we use the uniform keyword to do that, to export a value to the inspector. It's of type sampler 2D. That's the type you use to sample colors from a texture. Name of the variable, it's gradient. I'm passing a hint to Godot, hint black, so that if we don't pass a default texture to that value, we will get a color black. That way we don't get any errors with our shader. Okay, let's get started coding our shader. So you want to add the fragment function. This is the one that takes every pixel on the screen and we're going to use to manipulate it. We then want to store the input color from the sprite. So this is going to get every color we can see on the screen in the viewport from the texture. And for that, we create a vector for, that's the type for colors, and we use the texture function to sample the texture. This is a built-in type, this is a built-in value that gets this texture from the sprite, so the texture from the texture slot in the inspector, and we sample this texture using the UV coordinates. Let me expand the editor to center the code a little better. And then we are going to calculate the grayscale value from each pixel in the input texture. For that, you're going to use the dot product. The dot product between two vectors returns a floating point value. And you want to multiply the colors, so the RGB channels, the three color components, not the alpha value. We don't care about opacity, by a color. The values I'm using here for the color, 0.299 for the R channel, 0.587 for the green channel, and 0.114 for the blue channel. I found them on the internet. They are one formula, one way to convert RGB colors to grayscale, one approximation to do that. Another way is to average the values. So you take 33% of the R channel, 33% of the green, 33% of the blue, and it gives you a slightly different result as we saw in Krita moments ago. So we get a grayscale value that we can use to sample our gradient map. I'm going to shrink the inspector here, and our sampled color is going to use the texture function again. We're going to sample our gradient texture here, the first parameter, and for the UVs, we are going to use the grayscale value on the U-axis, and we don't really care about the V-axis because our gradient texture is just 1 pixel high, and anyway it's just a horizontal color range. Then we only grab the RGB values from that. You can see that I'm using a vector 3 for the sampled color, because for the alpha we are going to respect the input color's alpha value. We can then assign that result to the color out variable, to the RGB values. We're going to set it to our sampled color for now, and color.a, the alpha value, the transparency, is going to be the input color.a. And with that, we get a black result for now because we haven't set a gradient texture on our shader parameter. So take the gradient you just created, sunset, and click and drag it in the slot. You will see now the image is a bit blown up because our gradient is very contrasted in this case. And this is where we are going to add the mix parameter. So at the top of the shader, before the fragment function, we are going to add a new variable, a new uniform that we export called mix amount. It's going to be a floating point value, and we are going to use it at the bottom when we assign the RGB values to the color variable. So we're not going to take just sample color, but we are going to mix two colors. We are going to mix the input color's RGB value with the sampled color, and we're going to use mix amount as the mix amount. By default, mix amount is 1, which means that it is 100% the sampled color. But if you click and drag in the inspector, you can tone down the effect and move back to the original colors. Note that in the shader editor, for now, it allows you to go beyond 100% mix, and so the mix might get a bit harsh if you go too far, but if you set it to 1, like so, you will get 100% graded picture, and as you go down, you can control the effect. From there, all you have to do is to replace the gradient to get different effects. You can now go to your material. You want to maybe save it on the disk. Let's call it gradient map material. You could also save it as a .material file, although TRES is text-based file, so it's quite nice to have. And then you can reuse it on other sprites like Roby. I can expand the material category, get my gradient map material, click and drag into Roby. Note that as this is a shared resource in my file system, at this point, if I change the gradient on one of the two characters, it's going to change it on both of them. To avoid that problem, instead of saving the material, you can save the shader only and create new materials on every character. Or click on the arrow next to the material, make it unique, and you will still need to change the gradient map. But then the two sprites have different gradient shading applied to them. This technique is often used for photography, and you can use it for 3D games as well. Here's an example of some Instagram-like filter. If you use Instagram, this is how a lot of the filters work. They not only grade the picture, but they apply a little gradient map to your input file. Let's talk about creating shaders in Krita really quickly. The reason you might want to do that is for the great color palettes that you can get in a fully fledged image editor. You could use GIMP as well. And if you are used to working with those kinds of tools, you can create gradient textures. Just create a file. You can set the size to something like 256 on the width. The height could be 1 pixels, but if you are working on the desktop, for example, make the gradient a bit larger so it's easier to see. So I typically use 64:32. 64 for the video will be nice because it gives us a bit of height to work with. From there, G to go to the gradient tool. You're going to fill your gradient, so you can start by picking the foreground to background color gradient, the second in the gradient selector. Press D to reset to black to white, and click Shift and drag to the right side of the screen to get a default grayscale gradient. From there, you can override some of the colors by selecting a color in your palette that you like. You can click and drag to apply that gradient. Make sure to go to the gradient editor and to select the first one, foreground color to transparent, for more control. Now, you can use the grayscale if you don't want to change the luminosity of your pixels. You can use a blending mode. So in the toolbar, click the drop down menu and select color. And color will preserve the luminosity of the color, but it will change its tone, its hue, and its saturation. So you can use that to just recolor the darks to something purplish, like so, and the lighter tones to something a bit more yellowish. Although just working with the color blending mode sometimes won't give you the results that work best, right? So you still want to switch back to the normal mode and to use different colors manually for the best effect possible. You can then save that gradient as a PNG file. That's what I did with this one, and assign it to any of your textures or characters. And voila, with that you know how to create a gradient, you know how to create and use a gradient map shader. And if you want to go further, you can check once again our series with Bastiano Lige to learn to do 2D shaders in Godot and 3D as well. He's covered 3D water. You will learn all the basics you need to get started with shaders. I'm also including some link to Gonki's videos on the topic, which are really in depth to make fire 2D water, and he's got one on fog. Highly recommended. That said, I want to thank you kindly for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more. Be creative, have fun. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.